November, 1887. The high plains of the Montana Territory. In the thin, sharp air that promised a bitter winter, the laughter was the cruelest sound of all. It echoed from the porch of the general store, where a group of ranchers watched a lone figure on the far ridge. 18-year-old Finn was driving his small herd of 10 horses not toward the shelter of a barn, but directly into the black maw of the abandoned Widow's Grief gold mine. The men slapped their knees, their disbelief turning to open mockery. "Look at the mole boy," one of them shouted, his voice carrying on the wind. "Thinks he can hide from winter underground." Marcus Thorne, the biggest landowner in the valley with 100 head of fine stock and a brand new timber frame barn, just shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "He'll suffocate them before the first real snow. Or worse, poison them with damp and lung fever." The consensus was clear: the boy, thrown out by his drunkard father months earlier and left with nothing but his mother's horses and a stubborn streak, had finally lost his mind to grief and solitude. They saw a fool digging his own tomb. They saw a boy committing a slow, strange form of suicide for his only assets. What they couldn't see was the principle. They looked at the dark hole and saw a grave. Finn looked at it and saw a furnace, a slow, steady furnace powered by the very planet beneath their feet. He knew something about the deep earth that their surface-level thinking couldn't grasp. And if you're watching this, wondering how a dark, cold hole in the ground could ever be warmer than a barn, stick with us. Because when the great white hurricane of January 88 descended upon these plains, all that laughter would freeze in their throats, and this one boy's strange, counterintuitive method would be the only thing standing between life and a frozen, silent death. What do you think is the most misunderstood piece of old-world wisdom from your part of the world? Let us know in the comments below. For now, let's go back and understand what Finn knew that nobody else did. Finn's knowledge wasn't from a book. He couldn't read much more than his own name. His wisdom came from calloused hands and a quiet grandfather, a Cornish miner who had followed the gold rush west and found only disappointment. Before drink and sorrow took him, the old man would sit with a young Finn and talk not of gold, but of the earth itself. "The surface is a liar, lad," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "It shivers and it bakes. It does whatever the sky tells it to. But the deep earth has a long memory. It remembers summer in the dead of winter." His grandfather had explained the simple, profound truth that the ranchers, with their eyes always on the sky, had forgotten. Below the frost line, a few feet down, the ground holds a constant, steady temperature. In their valley, that temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't hot, but it was eternal. It didn't care about blizzards or suns. It simply was. After his father, in a drunken rage, had cast him out, Finn had spent the summer drifting, his small herd his only family. He saw the ranchers building bigger, draftier barns, convinced that thick walls of wood were the answer. They were fighting the cold with brute force, with stacks of cordwood and roaring stoves that devoured fuel and still left the corners thick with frost. It was a war of attrition, one they were destined to lose. Finn remembered his grandfather's words. He wasn't looking for a way to fight the cold. He was looking for a way to get away from it altogether. He found his answer in the Widow's Grief, a failed mine whose tunnels ran deep into the granite heart of the ridge. The ranchers saw a dangerous ruin. Finn saw a geothermal battery. The problem, as he saw it, wasn't the cold, it was exposure. The problem wasn't a lack of heat, it was a catastrophic loss of it. A traditional barn was a leaky bucket in a rainstorm. The mine was a sealed jar. The opposition began as soon as he started clearing the entrance. It wasn't just mockery, it was laced with genuine, if condescending, concern. Marcus Thorne rode up one afternoon, his own magnificent barn visible across the valley, a monument to conventional thinking. He stayed on his horse, looking down at Finn, who was wrestling a fallen rock from the mine's entrance. "Son, I don't know what you think you're doing," Marcus said, his voice flat and authoritative. "That shaft is full of bad air. You'll kill those animals. If the damp doesn't get at them, the roof will." Finn, his face smeared with dirt, just straightened his back. "It's got a vent shaft." "Breathes better than your barn," Marcus scoffed. "A vent shaft? You're trusting your life to a rat hole?" There's a reason we build in the open, boy. Fresh air and sunlight. You're building a tomb. The argument was logical, based on everything they knew. Animals needed air and light. The ground was cold and damp. Putting livestock underground was so fundamentally wrong it felt like a perversion of nature. Even Clara, the blacksmith's wife who had slipped him bread and jerky more than once, pleaded with him. "Finn, dear, it's not natural," she'd said, her eyes full of worry. "Think of the sickness. Animals belong above ground." Her husband stood behind her, nodding grimly. "She's right. A man who puts his stock in a hole is a man who's given up." The community chorus was relentless. The gossip in the general store painted him as touched by tragedy, a boy whose loneliness had curdled into madness. They talked about cave-ins, about poisonous gases seeping from the rock, about the sheer, oppressive darkness that would drive the horses mad. Every fear was practical, every warning rooted in common sense. They weren't just being cruel, they were trying to save him from a folly so obvious it was painful to watch. But their common sense was built for the world they could see, the world of sun and wind and snow. Finn was preparing for a world they couldn't, a world of deep, abiding, thermal constancy. He listened to their warnings, nodded, and kept digging. The work was brutal, a one-man war against entropy. It wasn't about just herding the horses inside. It was about engineering a sanctuary. First, he spent a week clearing the entrance tunnel, a passage that sloped gently into the earth for 100 feet before opening into a larger chamber. This tunnel was the heart of his system. It was the heat exchanger. As the frigid winter air was drawn into the mine, it would have to travel along that 100-foot corridor, the surrounding rock walls, at a constant 50 degrees, gradually warming the air before it ever reached the animals. The cold wouldn't arrive in a sudden, shocking blast, it would be tamed, civilized by the earth itself. He used scavenged timbers from a collapsed prospector's shack to reinforce the first 20 feet of the entrance, not because he feared a major collapse, the mine was cut through solid granite, but to create a solid door frame. He found the secondary ventilation shaft his grandfather had mentioned, a narrow fissure that climbed through the rock to an opening high up on the ridge, hidden by brush. It created a gentle, constant draw of air, a slow, silent breath that would prevent the buildup of moisture and ammonia. He spent days with a shovel and pick, carving a shallow, 6-inch-wide channel along the edge of the main chamber floor, directing the natural, slow seepage of groundwater to a sump pit at the far end, ensuring the area where the horses would stand remained dry earth, not mud. The main chamber was roughly 30 feet wide and 50 feet long, big enough for his herd and more. He wasn't just clearing a space, he was tuning it. He was listening to the rock, feeling the airflow on his cheek, observing how the dust moved in the lantern light. He was creating a system that didn't fight nature but cooperated with it. He packed the entrance with a thick, insulated door made of timber and packed earth, designed to seal the system. He was creating a pocket of thermal stability, an arc carved not from gopher wood, but from the ancient, patient stone of the mountain itself. The first test came in early December. A cold snap, a dress rehearsal for the main event, swept across the territory. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees to 5 below zero overnight. A bitter, relentless wind scoured the valley. In the town, stovepipes glowed red. Ranchers were up all night, breaking ice from water troughs and throwing extra blankets over their most valuable stock. The wind found every crack in their expertly joined timber, every gap under their doors. It was a night of shivering animals and exhausted men. Marcus Thorne, despite his new barn, lost a newborn calf. He stood in his own state-of-the-art facility and could see his breath, a plume of white in the lantern light. He cursed the cold and threw another log on the stable stove, the heat rising straight to the rafters while the cold pooled around his animal's feet. Miles away, inside the widow's grief, Finn checked his own thermometer, a precious instrument his grandfather had left him. The air in the main chamber was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The horses stood calmly, not a shiver among them. The water in their trough was cool, but liquid. The air was fresh, with the clean, mineral scent of the earth. When he cracked open the heavy door to the outside world, the 5 below zero air hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He sealed the door again, and the silence and the steady, neutral warmth returned. He had done it. It worked. The next day, when the snap broke, he led the horses out to graze in the weak winter sun. Sam, a young stablehand who worked for Marcus and possessed a curious mind, rode by. Heard Marcus lost a calf, Sam said, eyeing the mine entrance with a new respect. How'd yours fare in there? Finn just patted his lead mare's neck. They were comfortable, but when Marcus saw Finn's healthy, untroubled animals, his skepticism hardened into suspicion. A fluke, he declared at the general store. The ground still holding summer warmth. Wait till January. Wait till the real freeze sets in. That ground will turn to iron just like everything else. He's just delaying the inevitable, the town nodded in agreement. It was one cold night. Winter had barely begun. The real freeze arrived on January 12, 1888. It did not come quietly. It was a meteorological monster, a perfect storm of Arctic air, moisture, and cyclonic winds that history would remember as the school children's blizzard, or simply, the Great White Hurricane. It began as an unnervingly mild morning, a false spring that lured men out without their heavy coats. Then, in an instant, the sky turned a sickening shade of grey-white, and the temperature dropped not by degrees, but by tens of degrees per hour. A wall of white, a churning, roaring mass of snow and ice, slammed into the valley. The wind wasn't just a sound, it was a solid force, a battering ram that screamed past 100 miles an hour. It didn't just carry snow, it carried dirt, ice pellets, and debris, a horizontal blizzard that reduced visibility to zero. Within an hour, the temperature was 40 below zero, with a wind chill that defied measurement and sanity. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the sound, a deafening, soul-shaking roar that vibrated through the very bones of the houses. For the ranchers in their wooden barns, the fight was already over. They were trapped. The fine powder snow was driven by the hurricane-force wind through every microscopic crack, every seam in the wood. It didn't just draft, it infiltrated, filling the air with a blinding, suffocating fog of ice crystals. The concept of inside became a meaningless distinction. The cold was everywhere. While the storm raged, Finn was already sealed inside his sanctuary. He had felt the pressure drop hours before, a familiar ache in his bones his grandfather had taught him to recognize. He had led his horses, along with the 5 belonging to the nervous young stable hand, Sam, who had finally decided to trust the small boy over his boss, into the tunnel. He had sealed the heavy, earth-packed door, plunging them into a quiet, insulated darkness, broken only by the soft glow of his single lantern. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, there was only the sound of horses breathing and the gentle drip of water in the sump pit. The storm was a great and terrible audit of every choice a person had made. The valley became a laboratory of suffering, each homestead a separate, failing experiment. At the Thorn Ranch, the pride of the valley, the great new barn became a death trap. The sheer force of the wind found a purchase on the wide, pitched roof, and with a sound like a mountain cracking in half, it tore a 40-foot section of shingles and timbers away, exposing the cavernous space to the full fury of the blizzard. Snow and ice poured in. Marcus and his men, blinded and choking, tried to move the terrified, screaming horses, but the doors were already drifted over, frozen shut. They were trapped inside their own collapsing fortress, watching as their life's work, their prized stallions and broodmares, were flash-frozen where they stood. Hot heads and frozen feet, the fatal flaw of their design. The stoves they had, roaring away, sent all their precious heat to the now non-existent ceiling, while the super-chilled air pooled on the floor, encasing the animals' legs in ice. Elsewhere, smaller ranchers faced quieter, but no less final, tragedies. One family, the Millers, found their 3 milk cows frozen solid in their lean-to, still standing, their eyes wide open. Another man, trying to make it from his house to his barn 50 yards away, became disoriented in the whiteout and was found the next day, a statue of ice just 10 feet from his own front door. The very air was a weapon. Water turned to rock in seconds. Exposed skin blackened with frostbite in a minute. The conventional wisdom, the barns, and the stoves and the thick wool coats, were utterly, pathetically useless against a force of this magnitude. It was a cleansing fire of cold, and it was burning away every assumption they had ever held about what it took to survive on these plains. The cost of being wrong was absolute. 2 days later, the wind finally subsided, leaving behind a world transformed, buried, and silent. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, the sun reflecting off a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts. The temperature was still 20 below. For Marcus Thorne, it was a slow, grim walk through a graveyard he had built himself. Half his herd was dead. The survivors were sick, frostbitten, and traumatized. The financial ruin was catastrophic, but the blow to his pride was worse. He, the man who knew best, had been proven catastrophically wrong. And in his despair, a single, nagging thought took root: the mole boy. It was an impossible, ridiculous thought, but it was the only one he had left. Driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity, he saddled his strongest remaining horse and began the arduous trek toward the widow's grief, expecting to perform the grim duty of digging out a frozen boy and his animals. He arrived to find the mine entrance completely buried under a 20-foot drift. It was a seamless, white tomb. For a moment, he felt a pang of guilt. He had laughed while this boy was digging his own grave. With a heavy heart, he began to dig, his shovel biting into the hard-packed snow. It took him over an hour. Finally, his shovel struck wood, the top of Finn's door. He cleared the rest, his breath pluming, his muscles aching. He put his shoulder to the heavy door and pushed. It swung inward with a soft groan. And then it happened. A wave of air washed over his face. It was not the dead, frigid air of a tomb. It was humid. It was stable. It smelled of earth and hay and living animals. It was 50 degrees. Stunned, Marcus stepped across the threshold, his lantern held high. The sight that met his eyes would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. In the vast, quiet dark of the chamber, 15 horses stood calmly. Finn's 10, and Sam's 5. Their coats were sleek, their breathing easy. They looked at him with placid curiosity. Finn was at the far end, quietly forking hay into a low manger. He looked up, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so," there was only the quiet competence of a man who had trusted a principle and been rewarded. In that moment, Marcus Thorne understood. It wasn't magic. It was physics. And in the face of nature's ultimate power, the boy's simple, humble physics had defeated his own expensive, arrogant architecture. The news spread, not by word, but by sight. As the valley thawed and the true scale of the devastation became clear, hundreds of livestock lost, families ruined, the miracle at the widow's grief became a legend. The 15 horses that walked out of that mine, healthy and strong, were living proof of an impossible truth. They were emissaries from a different kind of world, a world where the earth was not an enemy to be conquered but an ally to be understood. Marcus, humble to his core, was the first to ask. He approached Finn not as a landowner to a stray, but as a student to a master. "How?" was all he could manage to say, gesturing back toward the mine. Finn, a reluctant teacher, didn't give a lecture. He gave a tour. He showed Marcus the long entrance tunnel, explaining how it warmed the air. He pointed out the ventilation shaft, the key to keeping the air fresh. He showed him the drainage channel that kept the floor dry. He explained the core principle: you don't need to create heat if you can simply stop losing it. The Earth's constant 50-degree temperature was the only furnace they needed. It was a revelation. It was so simple, so elegant, it felt like a cosmic secret hiding in plain sight. Soon, others came. Ranchers who had lost everything, their barns in splinters, their herds decimated, arrived at the mine with their hats in their hands. They had mocked the mole boy, and now they were begging for his knowledge. Finn, overwhelmed but seeing their desperation, began to teach. He walked their properties with them, showing them how to identify other stable, abandoned shafts. Not all were safe. He taught them to look for the signs of solid rock, to test for airflow, to understand the simple dynamics of geothermal exchange. The mole boy's folly was given a new name: the Finn Sanctuary. The idea spread like wildfire, a gospel of survival. Men who had spent their lives building with would now learn to build with earth. They weren't just copying Finn, they were learning the principle. That winter, they had tried to fight a blizzard with sticks and fire. Finn had taught them how to survive it with a thermometer and a shovel. In the years that followed, the landscape of the valley changed. The great, vulnerable barns were still built, but they were for summer and autumn. When the winter winds began to blow, the herds were moved to the new sanctuaries, the deep earth stables carved into the hillsides. The practice saved countless animals and, by extension, the livelihoods of the people who depended on them. Finn was never entirely comfortable with his role. He remained a quiet, solitary man, more at home with the silence of the earth than the chatter of the town. But he was no longer an outcast. He was the man who had listened to the ground while everyone else was shouting at the sky. He had become, in his own quiet way, the foundation of the community's resilience. Decades later, scientists and engineers would give his method a modern name: passive geothermal exchange and earth-sheltered construction. They would write papers, filled with complex equations and thermal diagrams, proving what Finn's grandfather knew and what Finn had demonstrated with rock and muscle. They would validate the profound efficiency of using the planet's thermal mass to buffer against extreme temperatures. The story of the boy who built a stable in a gold mine became a local parable, a story told to children to teach them a lesson that went far beyond animal husbandry. It was a lesson about humility. It taught that the most powerful solutions are often not the most complicated. It was a reminder that true wisdom often comes not from imposing our will upon the world, but from observing its rhythms and finding our place within them. The ranchers had seen a hole in the ground and perceived only darkness, danger, and death. Finn had seen the same hole and understood its connection to the deep, unwavering heart of the world. He proved that sometimes, the safest place to be during the storm is not in the fortress you build to defy it, but in the shelter you find by bowing to a power far greater than your own.